This is Jack McCallum, and you're watching the Breaking It Down show.
That's right. Got Jack on the Break It Down show. Jack's written, just some incredible books. You typically focus on basketball. There's a lot of, Jim Boeheim, a bunch of other books like that. But you've written your book about, well, I'll let you introduce the book, but this dude in the early 80s as a kid fascinated me with his Benihana boat and flipping upside down and almost dying in the dang thing. And just all of the unique things that he did. One of our really, like, in terms of the last 50 years, one of like those guys who stood out as an entrepreneur who just did really eccentric, dangerous, exciting things.
Yeah, this is Rocky Aoki. The book is called American Hiro, Hiro. We always look to do clever spellings in the publishing business. And Rocky was the key thing to remember about Rocky was that this is pre Elon Musk going into space. This is pre even a guy like Gates, who's not an adventurer, but got involved in the larger culture, did something with his money. So I'm not saying Rocky was the first one to do it, but he was somebody who took his money and sort of did all these outrageous things. First of all, in the interest of promoting his business, which was the Benihana restaurant, but also kind of leading an out on the edge life, away from the safe, I'm going to watch the business and order the vegetables and take care of the bottom line type of guy. So I wrote it back in 1983, and the book is an update of Rocky's life because he seems even more present now than he was 40 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, he's almost two generations later, like a Howard Hughes type of guy, where he's like, I have this money, let me do something really crazy with it, and the sky's the limit. And follow more in that vein than maybe the modern guys. Of course, the modern guys now are going to space, so that's just pretty crazy too.
Yeah, Rocky though. Rocky really put himself on the line. I mean, boat racing, which I would say is probably the most. Well, I mean, I guess you could argue you could flip a coin between that and hot air balloon racing. Obviously, if you crash in a hot air balloon, well, Rocky did crash and didn't die. So I guess the answer to that is no, you don't always die. But that powerboat racing's no joke. I mean, there's a lot of fatalities. There's a lot of injuries. And Rocky, I just remember within the first half hour of meeting him to do this book back in 83, Rocky showed me the wages that he had expended in powerboat racing. And that was a scar. I'm not going to lift my shirt up, but a scar that went from his neck all the way down. And that's the first time I had ever heard the phrase zipper, a zipper scar, which really stayed with me. His body was ripped open. It was literally ripped open, had to be sewed back together. And that's probably not the most amazing thing of the story. The amazing thing is he went back out there then. So that was Rocky. It was very hard. I'm not built like that exactly. My idea of fear was having a jet ski, back in the 90s. That's as far as I went. So this was interesting to plug into Rocky's mind and kind of measure him against other athletes that I've always spent my entire professional life covering.
Was he an athlete? I mean, is that what you consider that?
Well, Rocky was actually a very, very good athlete, and I actually kind of bonded with him in the beginning because Rocky was a wrestler. And I was not a wrestler, but where I came from in journalism back in Pennsylvania, where I still live, the local paper where I started, wrestling was the thing. I was the wrestling writer. Now, we're not talking about Hulk Hogan jumping off the top rope. We're talking about, collegiate style, Olympic style wrestling. And Rocky got over here basically because of wrestling. He was almost, Tokyo. He was the alternate in Tokyo's Olympic wrestling team.
Wow.
So he did start out very much as what you would call a mainstream athlete, and he kind of kept in shape in that way. He joined the athletic clubs and stayed like a fit guy, but eventually the toll of boat racing and balloon crashing, uh, you know, kind of did his body in a little bit. So he wasn't the kind of guy at 50 that was running marathons. He had worn himself out by then, but he started life as a very, very good athlete.
Yeah, I mean that the athlete thing is interesting, and then you come across and then you invent this kind of restaurant, at least for Americans. I mean, I remember being like mystified by the Benihana restaurant that was in my local area. And again, I'm like 10, looking out and I'm seeing this blue roofed place, and I'm like, let's go there. Let's go there. I always wanted to go. And then I found out that he had crashed his boat, and I'm like really into him then, what drove him to do something as impossible as invent a whole new restaurant style in America? I mean, that's not a thing some kid who's good at wrestling just walks into.
Right. Well, the first thing is that I think people have to understand Benihana now, in this age where the Food Network has been with us now, and everybody's a damn expert on food, and
Right.
we're very quote sophisticated. So Benihana's become a little bit restaurant and food wise of a little more laughing stock on the lower chain of things.
Right.
But when it started out, I mean, first of all, the food was always good. I don't care what anybody says. The food was very good at
Yeah.
Benihana, but this was a very exotic concept. There wasn't the only thing that I remember growing up, and I was 40 when no, I was 35 when I did this book on Rocky, were Chinese restaurants. That was our idea of exotic food when I grew up in the 60s. Oh my God, Chinese food, once in a while you could go and it tasted a little different. Then maybe some innocent Mexican restaurants. But what Rocky was doing was very different. I mean, as you said, with the way it looked exotic. It didn't invite us in the way that an American type of place would do. So what Rocky was doing was very I almost hesitate to use the word, but I don't think it's an exaggeration. It was revolutionary. For
Mm.
that reason, it was exotic. And number two, what he asked us to do was come in and sit with other people. Oh my God, that seemed very alien. And anybody who told Rocky he was going to fail told him Americans don't want to sit with other people. They barely like their own families. They're not going to go in and sit with somebody strange. So what Rocky did was very, very, very different. The question you ask about, I guess I don't want to keep talking here. Re-ask about how this happened. Why did he funnel this adventurism into restaurants? Is an interesting question too.
Yeah. Let's just paint a little bit more, because again, I'm a kid, like you said, that I was going to say, if you didn't say it, the Chinese restaurant, like that's where you went. People didn't go and eat sushi. Like that wasn't a thing that everybody had done or did regularly. It was adventurous to even do that, if you were even willing to do that. All pasta was called spaghetti. Like it was just a different. And I lived in California. This is not like I lived in, God bless, but Kansas or something. This is California, huge Asian culture, huge Mexican culture. But that thing to go to a restaurant like Benihana was just, it was unheard of. It was unheard of to do that. And then to eat raw, don't they just eat raw fish? Like those are the justifications. Like people in Europe all drank warm beer, and Japanese people ate raw fish, and it all sounded disgusting to us.
Yeah, and we had it went kind of beyond that, Pete, with the Japanese. I mean, there were all kinds of stereotypes. Number
Oh
one,
boy.
you said about eating, but we're only at the time when Rocky started the business. We are at most a generation removed from Pearl Harbor, and it was not just that. For the people that didn't hold political feelings against the Japanese, who we had partially imprisoned during World War II in internment camps, held a kind of other stereotype made in Japan. And this fixated Rocky. The idea that his country was thought upon as the place where you got shitty radios,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
this made in Japan idea. And never mind, as you said about the food, that we would have never thought. I mean, there was even a difference between Japanese and Chinese. We were sort of a little more familiar with Chinese food because, as I said, I grew up in the 50s, early 60s. You could get an egg roll. I mean, you could find out what it really wasn't Chinese food, but you thought you were eating it. Japanese, now you're talking something completely different, to the point you mentioned sushi. When I was doing the book, this is in the early 80s, mid 80s, it was a big deal that Rocky was going to go into sushi. So this is only, how long's that? 95, 30, 35 years ago. Sushi was not in the American mainstream. And once again, Benihana was one of the restaurants that brought raw fish to America. But Rocky would never have done it in the early days because we had this, Americans just had a complete revulsion of the idea that we would eat raw fish.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. It's so different now. Now, like, people brag about it. They do it at home. They only go to the sushi grade fish market, these things that Rocky, really, his fingerprints are all over this stuff.
My grandkids, and this is extraordinary to me. I mean, I didn't eat fish growing up outside of maybe you'd stick a fried flounder with French fries in front. My grandkids' favorite food is sushi. And they're like 5 and 7, and 9. And if my wife and I can't think of anything for them to eat, we go up. And not only that, we go up to a grocery store, Wegmans, that has pretty damn good sushi, and that's where we get it. And it was people like Rocky that put that forward, even though in the beginning, we have to be honest here, his menu was pretty, for want of a better word, unadventurous. That the concept he was doing was adventurous. The architecture in the place was adventurous. The idea that he had all Japanese chefs who were in front of you performing was adventurous. The food, you had your beef, chicken, shrimp. Beef, I think somebody in his circle called it the BCS, baby. Just put out the beef, chicken, shrimp, sesame seeds, sesame oil, soy sauce. And like I said, it was good. I mean, that's one of the things you knew at Benihana, that you were going to get good food.
Yeah. No, that's great. So you keep referencing starting the book, I mean, decades ago. Why is the book being talked about now? Is there a release date, a re-release? What's going on?
Yeah, the re-release is coming up in a week. But what happened was that, as you know, we live in such a different age. Rocky came along, so he's in the 1980s, this is. Well, people know him, and you said you knew him as a kid, but we didn't really see this potential. Streaming, this idea of putting all kinds of characters in front of our culture did not really exist. I don't think there was, I can't remember whether HBO was born, but there was an interest, and I don't have the full story on this, so I can't go off on the tangents about it, but there was an interest in doing a film about Rocky because he fits into this singular idea, the American, in his case, international hero who believes in himself, he didn't come from nothing, but he started in America with essentially nothing.
Right.
He has a real failure start in this business that we can talk about and built this kind of empire. And it has an arc, such a cinematic arc to it. But anything like that in our culture today has the potential, for mainstream type of dissemination. And it didn't back then. When I did the book, people knew him, but it wasn't like, oh my God, there's a bidding war to get Rocky Aoki's story. He wasn't Lee Iacocca. He wasn't a mainstream corporate hero. Whereas now, and we're seeing it with his son Steve is I'm not making this up, literally the world's most famous DJ.
That's right.
And that job didn't exist as far as I know, except on WABC radio in New York. So it's such a completely different time. And he had the idea to re-release the book with the idea that there are some people interested in doing the cinematic part of Rocky's story.
That's neat to bring a book back to life and such interesting character. When you look at someone like Rocky, and even possibly, I guess maybe an age peer, similar type thing. You have Bruce Lee. This goes right to like the best of what makes America great is that we can take these people that come in, and there's no reason that Rocky makes it other than he came here and you're allowed to, and then he works his way through whatever problems are in front of him and builds this empire that is, it's incredible. And then like his son becomes this cultural icon. Anytime you see in LA, if you go fly through LAX, if you see who might be a Japanese guy with long hair, you're like, ooh, is that Stephen Aoki? Like that's how famous he is. Like I hear all the time, oh, I think I saw him at LAX. Maybe not, you don't know, but
probably the way Steve travels, you probably do, because you probably did see him somewhere, because he has a schedule. I'm serious, unlike a frenetic schedule, unlike anything I have ever seen. He does a show in the afternoon. He was doing one in Washington, D.C. I remember this a couple months ago. I was trying to hook up with him for something, and he was in Washington at noon. And then I said, well, I'll see him in Atlantic City at night because he's doing a show there the next day. His manager said, no, the show's that night. The show is he's finishing the show in Washington, allowing 3 hours to drive up to Atlantic City, and then the other show starts. So that's kind of Steve's life. The other part of Rocky's story, though, Pete, is it does have kind of it's got the downward arc too. Inevitably in business, you have to make changes, things change, and Rocky had some downfalls too. And what I did was I didn't just re-release the book. I did some updating chapters at the end of it that talked about, the changes in Rocky's business and, Rocky's death, which was very sad for all his family. So the updated parts of it are in the book also.
When Rocky passes, he's young, especially for modern times. He's not even, he doesn't even make 70 years old, if I'm not mistaken.
No,
but he, his life does catch up with him in some ways because of all of the damage from probably even that boating accident ultimately contributes to his death. When you live that hard and that close to the edge all the time in boat racing and balloon racing, these things stack up.
Yeah, there's no question that happened to Rocky. Steve, his son, lives that kind of frenetic life. I can't say that he does all the things that Rocky does. Certainly the hours that they kept, probably similar in that, burning the, proverbial candle at both ends, 4 hours of sleep. Devin Aoki, Rocky's daughter, is a very interesting story too, that she was kind of a movie star, kind of one of the it girls in the early 2000s, beautiful girl. And Devin, kind of took the opposite track. She's a mom, she's raising her kids. She stays out of that life to a lot. And I found that I'm not going to be one to talk about Devin. I haven't plumbed her psychologically to know if she made a conscious decision on that. Well, she did make a conscious decision. Whether or not it had something to do with her dad and burning out, I really don't know. But she lives a completely different life in a way that Steve did, even though she started out She started out as kind of on the rise star. And one of their other brothers, Kevin, says, I used to be known as Rocky's son. Then I was known as Devin's brother. Then I was known as Steve's brother. I've never really had my own identity. He's the only one that followed. He's out in Hawaii, and he's the only one that followed his dad into the restaurant business.
Do they still own that restaurant business? Or no?
It's complicated.
I love it.
It's very complicated. There are Benihana restaurants, but they're under a different umbrella now. The ownership, has been a matter of it's been contested. It's in the final 2 chapters of the book, and honestly, it is involved in some litigation. Kevin, the restaurateur, is very successful with his own type of restaurants. Only one of which, if I'm correct about this, is sort of the Benihana concept. He has several other concepts, but Steve and Devin and the other kids did not get into the restaurant business. Steve said he washed dishes there, I think when he was 15 or 16 in one of the chain restaurants, I think back in Atlanta. And he said, I knew enough that this was not the life I wanted to pursue, because one of the things I talk about in the last 2 chapters are the way Rocky treated his kids. That Steve ended up as, I'm not going to take a guess on his income, certainly, multi-million-dollar income from DJing. Devin was in the movies.
Yeah.
But none of them were treated like the proverbial rich kids, that Rocky treated them kind of, put on a goddamn apron and get back in the kitchen and wash some dishes.
Yeah. That's a very common thing, though, right? I'll just say Asian family restaurants in general. You come out to Orange County, where I live, you can have any kind of restaurant from any country in Asia, and I promise you will see the family in there working and being taught how to run a business, being taught how to work hard. They won't have that rich entitlement thing as often as we might have in other cultures.
No question. And I didn't say this in the beginning, but Rocky kind of drifted into restaurants, entertainment, dining, because he's over here. What he loves about America is the kind of lack of that exact kind of opposite of what you're talking about that prevails in an Asian culture. Over here, you can be what you want.
Yeah.
There is not a paternal system where I'm going to work my way up. That wasn't Rocky. That's not what he wanted to do. Now, could he have channeled it into doing something else? Yeah, he could. But his father was actually in that business and owned a pretty successful, what was described to me as, I didn't meet his mom was Rocky's mom was Rocky's wife was alive, and so I was able to talk to her. She still is his first wife. His parents were not. I didn't get a chance to talk to them, but they had a very successful kind of entertainment mini empire in Japan, and it also was kind of Americanized. It played American jazz. And I remember one of the things that they said to me was his dad used real sugar. And they didn't do that. And they had all these little touches that they would make subtle compromises with the Japanese culture. So his dad, in a way, was a little bit of a Rocky type of guy and helped him out with his initial restaurants here, although, which is typical of father and sons, all they did was bitch at each other.
Yeah.
His mom was kind of the conciliator and refereed the arguments between them, and also was very important in establishing the Benihana restaurants over here.
When you met Rocky in the early 80s, when he's doing all these things, crashing his boat out in the San Francisco Bay, and that's kind of where I grew up. That's probably why I remember all this stuff. But what kind of guy was he then versus the guy towards the end of his life?
Well, I met him in the balloon stage,
Mm.
which you could call, I guess, the calmer stage
Is this
of his
post
life.
crash?
The balloon, as I recall, when we met, the boat race was 4 years in the past,
Gotcha.
and it was still kind of nagging him a little bit. And we went to a boat race. I went to a boat race with him down in Miami, and Rocky really, really, really wanted to get back in the boat. I mean, that's one of the first things I remember. And his second wife, Pam, um, just said, this isn't going to happen. I mean, they were, at odds all the time about Rocky, what he could and could not do. And so he drifted into hot air ballooning, which is not necessarily a natural a natural progression.
Yeah.
And he always claimed, and I believe him only to an extent, that really these were first and foremost promotional gimmicks for Benihana. That if
Okay.
you could put Benihana on your boat, or better, on a giant, air balloon that people would see. And so I believe that 50%, but I don't think you climb into a power boat or go up in a hot air balloon just for the promotion of your restaurant. Buy a billboard.
Yeah.
Come to Benihana.
Right. Yeah.
So when I think what interested me the most about Rocky was this sort of ambivalence between someone who was very composed, calm, almost soulful would be a word I would use
Okay.
when you talk to him and when you were around him. That contrasted with the things that he had done
Mm.
and the frenetic pace. If you could live your life frenetically, but also kind of slowly, that was Rocky, because he wasn't like this when you were around him. And he wasn't the guy that always, one of the things I talked about in the last two chapters was Rocky wasn't Trump. He wasn't, I'm here, look at me, everybody. That wasn't what Rocky was. People gravitated toward him, but Rocky in a crowd tended to sort of shrink away. So he was a person of big ideas and big accomplishments and big goals, but he wasn't really someone who
Mm.
always screamed for the attention. And I found that really interesting, and to completely unlock that was pretty difficult and probably remained elusive.
One of the things that and we all go through and we try to wrestle with how to do it. Our best attribute is often our downfall too. Like you have to
No
balance.
question.
What's that for Rocky? What would you say when you did you? I mean, obviously got into his head more than his daughter's head. So, what would you say is that balance he was always trying to strike?
Well, he was a little, and I'm a little bit like this, although not to the Rocky extent, and that is he jumps in. I have a joke with my wife about whether you're a writer or an editor. A
Mm.
writer's someone who hears an idea and go, "Oh hell yeah, I can make it. I can do something with that." An editor is someone who goes, let's wait a minute.
Yeah.
My wife is very definitely an editor. Well, that's not going to work for the following reasons. So Rocky dived into some business ventures later in his life
Wow.
and probably did not pay the kind of attention that you should have to run, a multi-million dollar business, because
Right.
I guess you would call that distractedness, but I would prefer to call it this spontaneity of leaping into new ideas. I did not leap into power boats and hot air balloons. And
Oh,
by the way, cross country racing, which was the final thing that he got into these crazy Burt Reynolds type of races where
all
you
run. Yeah.
yeah, across America, where he also could put Benihana on the car, even if it crashed or didn't finish the race.
Right.
Um, I didn't do that, but I understand this thing about trying, something new. But I didn't run multi-million dollar businesses or have a bunch of people working for me. And Rocky definitely made some business mistakes, trusted some people that he should not have trusted, and probably as he got older could have, toned it down just a little bit, listened to his body, listened to his advisors. But that wasn't Rocky. That wasn't who he was. And it
Yeah.
did cost him, some money, and it probably cost him, I don't know how long Rocky would have lived. I don't know that, but it certainly cost him some years too.
The Cannonball Run record is like just over a day, like 26 hours or something ridiculous like that. That sounds perfect for Rocky, and it's like you've got this Benihana sticker on your car, and the cops are like, guess what? We know what you're doing. But whatever. It's just good press to him.
Yeah, exactly. I wish I had finished the book. Like I said, I went out to a hot air balloon. I didn't go to a race. I went to a test with him in Albuquerque. So I was up in a balloon, but I was, fortunately for me, I was between the powerboat and the Cannonball Run. I was between those things, and so the balloon racing seemed kind of a little more mellow.
Yeah.
Although he did crash and probably almost, that has its own sense of peril, and in a
Yeah.
way, it's interesting, Pete, that Rocky's sense of promotion and promoting himself and promoting Benihana, he went up in a hot air balloon when you are gone. Yeah, you get some publicity about it at first, and then you get some publicity about it when you crash or land.
Right.
In between, you're just doing the hard job of staying up there. Nobody's looking at you. Nobody's charting your course. Nobody's writing about you. They write about you when you take off, and they write about you when you crash or land. And I always found that kind of interesting that Rocky had that in the middle of his adventurous career.
I suppose nowadays you could hire some young person to do social media and social mediate for you while you're in the balloon, and
Yes,
some attention.
it would
But
be different. And I said something about that in the book. Had Rocky been here's a guy that wasn't in the social media age,
yeah,
like his son and his daughter Devin were. It would be interesting, and I think you hit it. I think Rocky would have to hire. I think Rocky would have 6 people doing this for him. Rocky would not take the time to sit down and start scribbling this stuff out himself.
yeah,
But he would have had a staff of people, and he would have maximized the social media world. There was, and who's to say, with a social media aspect to his company, and a time where he would have gotten more involved, like as a personality on the Food Network, let's say. I mean, he would have been a dream, but he was just a little bit too early for that. And Benihana might have had a whole different denouement if Rocky had come along when he could have taken advantage of social media and the Food Network.
yeah. Everybody, just the link down below says American Hero. You can get the book on Amazon, or you can just go to Jack's website. I'll put the link up for Jack's website. Just going down there, and there's all kinds of stuff. Jack has written a lot of books, not just these ones, but we're talking about American Hero now. Rocky Aoki's story. He was this, super wealthy guy who did crazy things like drive a car as fast as he could across a nation, or fly, hot air balloons so aggressively that it can become dangerous. And of course, high speed boating, which for me, that stuck with me, man. Again, he caught me at the right time where I was super impressionable. And I remember thinking, man, I like going fast, but on the water, it's not forgiving, And so even like now today, like if a friend of mine has, a matter of fact, I know a guy that has a very fast boat. We were out in the Delta and by the bay, and he's like, let's go fast. And I'm like, yeah, no, thanks. No, thanks. I've seen you working on this thing. I don't know if the trim tabs are long enough. And it totally had an impression with me. And I wanted to add this in too. Another brand that was big in boat racing for whatever reason, and it must be, and they must have known each other, is whoever decided it was a good idea to have a circus racing boat, like a pickle boat that had the circus brand on it. Because circus is not a brand that you ever think of about anything other than maybe, hey, I can take my kids to this casino and they'll have a good time.
Yeah, I met the circus guy. The guy I remember that was really close with Rocky was the Popeyes guy. He
That's
was, and I can't remember his name. Some of your listeners probably know who I'm talking about, but he was one of those characters like Rocky, who had all this money, and Popeyes. I don't even remember it back then, but he was one of the he was one of the guys down there, one of the main guys. And I know Rocky kind of Rocky admired him, that he had sort of put his money and his body where his mouth was. It wasn't just, it's one thing putting your money where your mouth is. When you put your money and your body where your mouth is, that's something completely different. And that's what Rocky did all the time.
I know along the way, there's been a lot of big fried chicken brands. I mean, obviously Kentucky Fried Chicken, but there's Maryland's and there's Brown's and there's Church's, and to get Popeyes to even be a national brand, it is really Rocky like. Though those guys are remarkable to stand out in a crowded field, and a lot of those brands don't exist on the scale they used to, or if at all, anymore.
Yeah, no question. And I one thing I just want to mention, because this idea that nobody should think that Rocky started out with very much, because I can't emphasize enough, when he opens a single restaurant in New York,
Right.
for weeks and weeks and weeks, nobody comes.
Wow.
And when we say nobody, we almost mean that literally. He said he had a Japanese gentleman, came in every night. Hey, I like it. There was nobody there. And one night, now this is the version of social media back in I can't remember exactly what year it was, 69, 70. This is 71, it might have been. This is social media back then. The restaurant critic from the New York Herald Tribune, which doesn't even exist anymore, was this woman named Clementine Paddleford. Whether or not she invented that name, I don't know.
Yeah.
And she was known as White Glove Mary or something like that. She was the discerning food critic for New York City. So Clementine Paddleford strolls into Rocky's restaurant looking as out of place, as a bouncer at a cotillion, sits down. They're nervous as hell. What she's going to hate this place. She writes this rave review about Rocky's restaurant that appears in the New York Herald Tribune. I think I have the paper right. I should have checked the book. Anyway, yes. It wasn't the New York Times, and it wasn't the Post or the Daily News. So the magazine, the review appears, and within days, people are just flooding to the restaurant, to the point that very quickly Rocky's problem from having no revenue went to the opposite restaurant problem of not having enough resources. And he quickly builds this other restaurant. It went up like that, even though he imported Japanese architects to do all this work. I mean, their work ethic is, not to expand on a stereotype, but their work ethic in assembling these restaurants was extraordinary. I mean, Rocky went from from this one restaurant to these things kept being a success. And within a few years, he had like 25, 30 restaurants. He would open 2, 3, 4, 5 restaurants a year. And so it was kind of that version of social media. Something could go viral, almost like the New York Times reviewing a play that's going to close.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, so you did have these singular sources of powerful information back then. And it just happened that one of them happened into Rocky's life, and he has no idea if she didn't come into the restaurant, if she didn't like it, if people didn't read her review. He has no idea if he
Right.
would have made it. So he took this break, and then he maximized it.
Yeah.
That's
Boy,
sort of what you have to do.
If the restaurant where I grew up, it was in a mall, a newer mall that struggled for, gosh, probably 20 years. That mall struggled. Now it's exploded and there's a mall next to that mall and everything else. But his is the oldest, longest lasting
It's
business.
still there. Is Benihana still there?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. Last time I drove by it. Yeah.
Yeah, it does not have it does. I can't remember how many freestanding restaurants there are, but as I said, the business has it's under the umbrella of some other restaurants and things like that. So the Benihana name is still out there, but for a long time, it was the singular destination for exotic food, which was beef, chicken, shrimp was the formula.
What happened to that brand? What do you think? Was it Rocky's inattention? Was it? I mean, why did it go from being this thing that was exotic to being this thing that look, they make fun of it on King of the Hill and everything else? And
well, I live in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and when I started working a small paper here in 1970, you could drive down and go across the bridge, and Bethlehem Steel did 3 shifts. At 3 o'clock in the morning, there were flames coming out of the furnaces at Bethlehem Steel. 6, 7 years later, there's one shift.
Yeah.
15 years later, there's nothing.
Yeah.
So you have to change. I mean, I'm talking about a subject. Books have been written about Bethlehem Steel. I don't mean to simplify this, but
Right.
I mean, the magazine I work for, Sports Illustrated, kind of went through the same thing. You have to change. You have to see things in the future. And Rocky, in this is just my opinion, got kind of caught between it wasn't incredible fine dining and it wasn't fast food. So all these great fast food, I mean, you can get great Japanese and Chinese fast food, and Rocky didn't exactly compete with that.
Yeah.
And then the fine dining, you were talking earlier about sushi restaurants where people will pay $55 for an eel roll. He didn't exactly do that.
Right.
So Benihana got a little bit caught in the middle, and Rocky himself, got in trouble with the Securities and Exchange Commission about some insider trading. Again, it referred back to what I said. He trusted some people he couldn't trust. That doesn't mean it's not his fault. It was his fault. It's his business. But nevertheless, that was Rocky's kind of undoing. And so a lot of money was spent on that. And there were just a variety of reasons that Benihana did not stay on top of the field.
It's also really hard to stay on top of the field. I mean,
Very,
there are things that can happen.
very difficult. I'm trying to imagine, if we could somehow go 20 years in the future, 10 years, will Amazon still be Amazon? I mean, it's a fascinating topic because even if you try to stay away from Amazon for political reasons or whatever, you can't do it.
You can't.
So in 10 years, what's it going to be in 10 years? And everybody's got to change. And it's, the eternal lesson of business.
I find Rocky super fascinating, but I wonder if we can pivot over to the Big Dipper, because if there are two guys that are in the same house of how successful they were and how iconic they were, it's for sure Wilt Chamberlain and Rocky, because they both are just, they fill the room in terms of like the things that they've done and who they are. These guys are incredible.
You must be are you a Philadelphia guy?
No. I just look. Okay, so a while back on the show, we had a guy named Jeff Traeger, and he was the guy who ran around in his convertible, with bag full of drugs and some good ideas. And he sold songs to radio stations, and he broke acts like Ike and Tina Turner. He made that song Chariots of Fire. He broke that song. That's what he did, right? And so he worked. Became really good friends with Wilt Chamberlain, and we hear his stories, and Jeff is like 5'6", or whatever, 5'8". Let's not take any inches away from him. He's probably 5'8". But they would play one-on-one, and he would stay at one of Wilt's houses when Wilt wasn't in town, when he was with the Warriors and everything. So there's just a zillion stories. So I'm not a Philadelphia guy, but I am a Wilt guy. When you think about the fact that they had to change the nature of the floor of the court to limit his impact.
Well, I am a Philadelphia guy. I was born and raised in South Jersey, and my father would take me to Philadelphia Warrior games. They were not the 76ers back then, Philadelphia Warriors. And Wilt was the only word for Wilt is mythic.
Uh-huh.
Wilt has records in basketball that are so stupid that you can't even, like, I teach, I've done a lot of college teaching, and people are obsessed with Michael Jordan. I get it. I covered Michael. They were my guys. Nobody would know my name in journalism if it wasn't for covering Michael, Magic, Larry.
Yeah.
And I say to them, well, how many 50-point games do you think Michael Jordan had? Now, I'm unfortunately, I raised this, and now I'm not sure the exact answer, but the answer is something like, and they'll say, oh, the answer is something like 40 or something like that. Wilt Chamberlain had like 125.
Yeah.
He averaged 51 points in one season per game. Yes. That means he scored 51 points. But my favorite stat of all time in any sport is that Wilt, in that season when he scored that point, averaged playing time more than the minutes that are in a game.
Yeah.
Because A, he played every minute, and we're talking overtime games, and B, he never fouled out. And so Wilt exists in this kind of pantheon by himself. And two great Wilt stories I just have to tell you, because it feeds into this mythic thing. I was doing a story about centers just about 30 years ago for Sports Illustrated, and I was trying to get in the hold of Wilt. And somebody at SI, a great writer named Frank DeFord, was the only one that really knew him. Frank had Wilt's number. And this was just when cell phones are starting. It may have even been a hard line. I'm not sure. But I called, and Frank said, he's probably not going to call you back, but go ahead, call him. So I dial Wilt's number, and I'll never forget his message was, speak, you might get lucky. That was Wilt's message. And we're eating in Los Angeles one night in this kind of nice restaurant where they have a sign, proper attire required. And it's very noisy. And about 8:00, Wilt strolls into the place in a pair of what we used to call clam diggers. They were pants that went like right below your knees, and bare feet, and a t-shirt. He always had like a strapless kind of t-shirt on. And he walks into the place to get his takeout, and the place conversation just ceased. There was we just watched Wilt for 5 minutes go to the window where he was the only takeout guy, gave Wilt his food, and he walked out.
Yeah.
And that was Wilt. There's really never been anybody. The closest thing to Wilt is Shaquille. And for this reason only, is that they both had this immense size and therefore never went through a moment of life when they were not noticed. Every minute that they lived, they were the most obvious thing in that universe, and they were both comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Bill Russell was not. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was not. I have not lived in their skin. I'm not 7 feet tall. I'm not black. But it can be very difficult. Wilt and Shaq, here I am, man. This is the big package. This is who you got. Yeah. And I didn't know Wilt, only had met him a couple times. Shaq, I knew very, very, very well. And I always admired that about him. And if I was that big and had that kind of highway that I had to travel through life with. I would hope that I would enjoy it to the extent that Shaq and Wilt seem to have enjoyed it.
Another stat from that year was 25 rebounds a game. That's a good player's 3 games.
Well, no question. I mean, him and the game was different. That
Sure.
centers dominated. Russell and Wilt used to routinely get 20. I mean, would you say he averaged 25 rebounds? I mean, there would be games they would get 31 rebounds because they would get the rebounds. But the thing about Wilt, which is, his legacy was still that he never got quite enough credit because, and it's an argument that we're still having today.
Yeah.
And I wrote a book about the 72 Lakers. It was called Golden Days. And it was sort of this attempt to tie together the Golden State Warriors and the Lakers of back then through Jerry West. Anyway, this was getting near the end of Wilt's career. This is 71-72. Wilt has gone through much of the season with a broken hand. The Lakers have never won. They can't beat the Celtics. They did not win in Los Angeles despite having Elgin Baylor, despite having Jerry. They haven't won. Wilt's at the end of his career. He's got a broken hand. And Jerry West told me that, and he's not shooting, he's shooting like 10 times a game, not 40 times a game. Wilt won that even at the end of his career. He was this indomitable guy that had switched over by then, played defense during that series, dominated the game with his rebounding. And the only reason the Lakers finally, not the only reason, the main reason the Lakers finally broke through in 71-72 was a Wilt Chamberlain, completely different player that he was at the beginning of his career, now at the end of his career. He was the reason.
When we talk about the greatest of all time in terms of basketball players, Michael Jordan and LeBron are the main candidates. But, Wilt, I mean, he had to change the game because, look, if they change the free throw rule back to what it was, I don't know that there are that many dudes that could just jump from the free throw line on free throws and just dunk the ball. I mean,
I've never seen that. I've always heard that. I've never seen that archival footage that Wilt could do that. But I tell you what pretty much is the Wilt rule. And it I think people miss it a little bit, and a profound effect on the game. And that was widening the lane. That they did that in 1963-64 season. That I'm not having the right dimensions here, but the lane used to be like that. So Wilt would be so close to the basket that his ultimate shot was just this kind of get the ball 2 feet from the basket. If he didn't dunk it, he could just flip it back over his head. He had astounding touch on short shots. I mean, people think, oh, big guy, all they got to do is dump it. They are very, very hard to do. Short shots, right, flipping them toward the basket. So now they widen the lane. So Wilt has to stay, much further from the basket, kind of got a fadeaway jump shot. And not long after that became more of a passer that the offense would run through him. You'd throw it into Wilt, people would scissor off of him. Very clever passer, much in the same way the game's played today, because now a big man who's dominant gets the ball, they start to double team him. He's got to figure out a way to get rid of it. So Wilt was somebody who just transformed the game, but he transformed himself a couple different times during his career. And I wish he were alive because he was a larger than life person who left too soon.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was a real shock when he left. You got to see Wilt. You got to see a lot of players on the way. You covered Michael, Larry, and Magic. LeBron's been around. I'm sure you've seen some of his work. Do you have a GOAT? Do you have a opinion on that?
Well, when I'm asked this question, which is a lot, I'm a product of my own prejudices and experiences. And so if somebody says to me, who's the greatest player? I think it's LeBron. I do not jump up and down and wave my arms. I say, excellent choice.
Yeah.
I say Michael Jordan for
Mhm.
simply the reason that I came along covering Michael. Michael was always sort of better than his hype. No matter how much you hyped him, and Nike came out with a new commercial or Nike comes out with a new campaign,
Right.
Jordan always lived up to it. He got to the finals 6 times. He won 6 championships. He was the MVP 6 times. And he averaged more points in the playoffs than he did during the season. So I am probably biased toward players who were out on the floor. That is, if you ask me, why wouldn't you say Russell or why wouldn't you say Will? My own prejudice is that a great player is that they couldn't influence the game. That might be a little different from Wilt's standpoint, but a big man inside can't influence the game quite as much as a Magic, a Michael, a LeBron, since they have the damn ball all the time, particularly
Yeah.
LeBron. LeBron has the ball longer before James Harden, I guess, who's never won, but LeBron had the ball all the time, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he was quarterbacking where it was going to go. But what I always say, if you put Michael and LeBron into a gym and you told them that only the winner could come out, even if it takes you 14 or 16 hours, it's hard for me to believe somebody would walk out beside Jordan. That is a very unscientific, unanalytical answer, but it's the best answer that I can come up with from somebody who covered the game during that golden age of the 80s and into the 90s.
Yeah, when you watched Michael play, you knew that there was going to be a special game. Like he was just was better. The game had to go through him. You were welcome to beat him, and people certainly did, but you didn't reliably beat him. He was just so tough. You could get him under the hoop and we fouled him, but next thing you know, the ball goes up towards the basket. He got that and one just often enough just to always have the advantage. He just had that next gear every time you needed it. And even when he missed a shot, because he certainly did miss some game-winning shots, he made them so frequently when they mattered the most so often that you don't remember those times. You must watch him. And I don't know that is the same for, Magic was must watch also.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. The two guys that I compare, I compare Michael a little bit more to Kobe. I mean, they were scorers.
Yeah.
That's what LeBron always wanted. And early in his career, this was used against LeBron. Oh, he wants to be too much like Magic. He wants to find the right guys to pass the ball to. And it's true. He gave up shots to get it to Danielle Marshall in the corner. Well, should you do that?
Right.
Well, probably not. But let's not call it a cardinal sin. Let's not call it a moral failing. And I think LeBron dragged that baggage with him a little bit. Whereas Michael came into the league, this is my frickin' team.
Yeah.
Get out of the way. Now, Kobe, which is interesting because came in with Shaq when he didn't come in with him, but ended up having, 3 in a row with Shaq, where he had to be somewhat of a complimentary player. And I think we forget that about Kobe a little bit, because Kobe eventually became, and I say this in the most positive of terms, I mean, Kobe was a pain in the ass as a teammate.
Yeah.
This is my team. I don't even want to hear from you.
Right.
Michael used to pay somewhat lip service to having other guys. These are my guys, and he'd throw his arm around them, and BJ Armstrong, and I love Pax, and I love these guys. When in fact, he was just killing them in practice and everything. Kobe didn't even live that illusion, and pretty much, won the 2 championships later in his career with being I mean, he had Pau Gasol and he had Rick Fox and some guys.
Yeah, they're good players.
Yeah, they were good players. But that was a Kobe. That was a Kobe deal. But that's the two I compare. Whereas I compare LeBron a little bit more to kind of Magic. Hey guys, come around. We want to be Magic.
Yeah.
We want to be a team. We want to be. I'm the leader here, but we all want to be together on the same page.
One of the things about the GOAT argument is I think it's too reductive, and it, removes a guy like Elgin Baylor from consideration or anything. But if you like, when does greatness, that kind of greatness, begin? Like, who's that entry level player? That's one thing I want to ask you about. The other thing is we tend to say, like, could Wilt play today? Well, how would you play in Wilt today when there was no high end? Like, you couldn't afford to even hire a chef or a nutritionist, or they didn't have pressure plate workouts and all these specific things. You wore Converse, actual Converse on the basketball court. All of these things were like Jesse Owens. You wore dress shoes with nails in them and ran on a track that had ashes on it, and they had puddling and, so could you go back to that era?
Baseball gloves. You ever look at baseball gloves?
The smallest little thing.
Well,
yes, those are like, when does greatness begin at that level? That do you consider these people, like, are there 100 guys at that level? Is it higher up? Like, like the 75th anniversary team, is half of that in that upper echelon? And then also, what if you took players back in time?
Yeah, interesting question. And I'm working on a book now. This doesn't really answer it because it's a hard question, but I'm working on a book about Oscar Robertson's high school in Indianapolis. This is in the 50s. There's a reason that I'm doing it. It's not just, they had a great basketball team. Anyway, so I'm looking at films from the 1950s, some video footage from the 1950s. Oscar used to stand alone. I mean, before Michael, before LeBron, Oscar was, would be on anybody's top 5. Now he's probably moved to the second 5, and you got to have Magic and Michael at the backcourt. Anyway, you would not believe what ball handling was like back then. I mean, it is completely unsophisticated. Any right-hander going to his left dribbles with his right hand.
Yeah.
Nobody. And the gap between the early 50s and then I'm watching Oscar 4 or 5 years later is incredible. That Oscar changed the game. Oscar's crossing over. Oscar's going at a stop and go speed that nobody else is. So were there 10 moments like that, and Oscar was one of them? Probably. But my bailout answer always is that the best players from any era would somehow figure out a way with new training and new best practices available. Best practices are not smoking cigarettes, before the game, stuff. It's not having a job selling insurance in the off season. You probably should be lifting weights.
Right.
That the best players in any era would be able to make that transition, and I really think they would. How many of those guys there are? I voted on that top 75 team as I voted on the top 50 team. My joke was I will not be around to vote on the top 100 team because I'll be almost 100 myself. But I did vote on both of them and looked very carefully and tried to decide. And I'm not going to go into it, but I kicked some guys off in favor. Some of the 50 guys kicked off in favor of the 75 guys. But you can always find, I mean, the way those people traveled back then, what you had to do to play, even when I started covering the league in the 80s, everybody was flying commercial.
Right.
And by the time, by the end of my first tenure covering it, most people were, had charters.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different way. I remember interviewing Darryl Dawkins in coach of a U.S. Air that we have a seat this wide.
Yeah.
And Darryl's like there.
Yeah.
I have my ass like up on the seat, but this is how Darryl is traveling. So things are always different. The best players, I think, would find a way to be great in any era.
I grew up sort of near where Rick Barry's kids grew up, and I think it was Drew Barry was playing basketball where I played, and I happened to be the guy guarding him. I'm doing quotey fingers because you're like, who he is. Is it Drew? It might have been Brent. Might have been Brent Barry. And I'm backing up, and I'm like, and like I prided myself on I wasn't the greatest shooter, but I could pass and I could defend pretty well. So I'm going to give it my best. And there's That's what I'm going to do. So I think he's going to pull up to do like a mid-range jumper thing. And so he goes up and I'm like, haha, I got you. You've jumped already. You left the ground. Now I'm going to go up. And I can't jump as high as you can, but I've got the advantage. So I go up. I start to come back down and his foot flies by my face. He wasn't shooting a jumper. He was going to dunk it. And I'm like, there is an enormous gap between where I am and where he was. And then that gap again to great
between Brett and, the Immortals. But Brett was crazy. Brett was crazy athletic. He won a dunk contest.
Yeah.
Brett
Super
won a dunk contest. And his father, Rick, who was, I didn't cover him. I knew Rick. And his father's one of the very, I'm not going to say he's underrated, one of the very guys you skip over when you're thinking of great players, because Rick was not the most popular guy. Right. In his career, he careened between the ABA and the NBA. Yep. He could kind of be a little bit of a knucklehead factor, got in contract squabbles, wasn't the most political guy. But Rick had astonishing ability. If you're talking about 10 players who could do everything, Rick Barry just may be in that list. Phenomenal player.
Well, listen, I don't want to take any more of your time. That was fun. I could talk more basketball and Rocky stuff all day because it's just fascinating. But I appreciate you guys coming on. And then I wanted to remind everybody, go get American Hero. Here's the link for it on Amazon. It comes out, I believe, tomorrow or the next day, sometime later this week.
Yeah, go to the link. I haven't done as great a job. If anybody's still listening to me ramble on here, I haven't done as great a job with my website as I should. So please get it at the Amazon link. And I'm Twitter at McCallum 12. Everybody like us uses their old high school basketball jersey number in their Twitter handle. So I am at McCallum 12. I'll post about the book up there.
Okay, there you go. All right. Yeah, there's
it's even spelled correctly, which is great.
I got lucky this time. It's hard when you fly the machine and do the talking and shut down the show. Stand by. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank